On the 9th of December 1989, the police were called to a house in the Riverside area of Cardiff.
The body was found in the garden of the house yesterday afternoon. It was in a shallow grave and wrapped in a carpet.
All the detectives had to go on was a young girl's skeleton that had been buried for some years.
The woman was in her early 20s, but the cause of death still remains a mystery, as does her identity.
To help in their inquiries, a clay reconstruction of the girl's head was made from her skull.
But they're appealing for anyone with information to get in touch on Cardiff 565.
The results were swift. Within weeks they had a name, Karen Price, and 2 men suspected of her murder. But they also had a problem: how to prove that the skeleton was Karen's. In this case, normal forensic methods were just not enough. They needed more evidence. It was then that they heard about a small research project being carried out by a biochemist. It all began about 4 years ago in a laboratory at Oxford University, where Dr. Erika Hagelberg was studying bone fragments to see if any genetic material could be extracted from them and the DNA sequenced, something no one had done before.
A lot of people thought how wonderful if this could be done. Others said it's impossible, and everybody knows that it's impossible to recover DNA from bone. And other people asked, from what part of the bone are you recovering DNA or hoping to recover DNA? And we just had no idea.
Despite the skepticism, Dr. Hagelberg was willing to give it a try.
And I started crushing bones, and lo and behold, recovered some DNA. But at that time, we had no idea whether the DNA was fungal or bacterial or insect DNA.
Her test confirmed that she was extracting human DNA, but Dr. Hagelberg waited before publishing her results.
I didn't actually write that paper for a year after I had the first results, because I wasn't really sure myself that what I was working with was a real phenomenon rather than an artifact. I also got a lot of flack at conferences because it was difficult for other people to repeat the results.
The problem was that the DNA samples Dr. Hagelberg was getting from bone were often severely degraded. And also, 99% of all the DNA she recovered was bacterial or fungal contamination, not human at all. So even before the human DNA could be measured, it would have to be isolated and amplified. For this, she needed to use a technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. This allows a strand of DNA to copy itself thousands and thousands of times. But of course, you have to start with the right piece of DNA.
The problem of contamination is the biggest problem, and the fact that we're using such a powerful technique as a polymerase chain reaction to amplify perhaps just 1 or 2 molecules of DNA remaining in the bones. And we are handling so much modern DNA in our laboratory that the possibility of contamination is very, very great. And I take enormous precautions in the course of my work to have controls for every single stage of the extraction and of the amplification project. But it's very easy to make a mistake, and it's very easy to amplify spurious sequences.
The unlikely answer to Dr. Hagelberg's doubts came from, of all things, the Mary Rose. When Henry VIII's flagship sank in 1545, everything was carried to the bottom. Its provisions, including pig carcasses, were recovered when the ship's hold was pulled out of the mud. Dr. Hagelberg managed to obtain one of these pig bones, and with the same technique she used on human samples, tested for DNA.
And lo and behold, it was a perfect pig sequence, an ambiguous pig sequence. And that was quite a miraculous morning, because for the first time we were completely sure that what we were working with was endogenous bone DNA and not contamination from people handling the bones or from human DNA in the laboratory.
At last, Dr. Hagelberg was convinced her technique worked, but her research could have continued in relative obscurity had the police on the Karen Price case not run into a problem. Karen's dental records didn't exactly match those of the skeleton, so doubt was thrown on its identity. After hearing of Dr. Hagelberg's work, the police sent her a sample of bone with the hope there would be enough material in it to produce a DNA fingerprint, a pattern of DNA unique to Karen Price. Dr. Hagelberg worked on this project with Professor Alec Jeffreys, who developed DNA fingerprinting. If she could get anything out of the bone, he would be able to match it up with DNA in blood samples from Karen's parents.
That's a radiograph.
When we were first approached over the body in the Carpet case, my initial reaction was no, that any DNA that would be left in there would be in such tiny amounts and so severely degraded it would not be amenable to DNA typing. As it turned out, we were proved wrong.
The bone sample did contain enough DNA to be sequenced, and Jeffreys, using special markers, managed to prove that the DNA came from a child of the Prices. They were now 99% sure the body was Karen's. But the evidence still had to be accepted by the court in Cardiff.
I think there were three aspects which made this new as far as the courts were concerned. The first was the whole idea of typing an individual from bone DNA. Second was the use of DNA amplification, which we had to use to type this tiny amount of DNA. And the third were the genetic marker systems, the actual tests that we used, made use of markers which hadn't been given in evidence in UK courts before.
But the police case was accepted, and on February the 28th this year, almost 10 years after her death, Karen's killers were brought to justice. The extraordinary thing about Hagelberg and Jeffreys' work is that this court accepted the evidence, even while many scientists still doubted whether getting DNA from bone was possible. Despite those doubts, attention has now turned to another mysterious case.
We're looking at the Joseph Mengele case, the question of whether skeletal remains found in South America were those of the Auschwitz camp doctor. At the moment, we've carried out the analysis. It's exceedingly difficult, but we have recovered DNA typing information which we believe is authentic and relates to the individual. Could be contamination, we don't know. At the moment, we're awaiting, with eager anticipation, blood samples from the living relatives of Joseph Mengele, so we can do the comparison. The problem is, of course, that the DNA information that we get out doesn't carry the name and address of a person. We have to have relatives or an authenticated sample from that individual to make the comparison.
So, old bones may contain DNA, but some fundamental questions remain. Not least, where is this DNA hiding? Living bone is a calcium matrix, constantly being built up and broken down by the cells within it, stained dark here. When the bone dies, the soft tissue is lost, and all that's left is the calcium superstructure, frozen in time. However, it would seem from Dr. Hagelberg's work that some of the original bone cells containing the DNA survive, entombed inside the structure they themselves built.
From recent work with scanning electron microscopy, we can actually see intact bone cells sandwiched inside the bone, even surrounded by areas that are completely broken down and remodeled. And we actually showed that even in fairly poorly preserved bone, we saw areas where there was intact bone.
Well, it's hiding deep in the matrix of the bone. I mean, that we do know from the way that Erica has extracted the DNA. We're not looking at bone marrow here, but it's deep inside the bone. My guess is that you'll initially get quite a lot of DNA loss through rapid degradation. I suspect then the thing will stabilize, that the DNA will then slowly disappear away from the bone with a speed governed by precise burial conditions and so on.
But if the calcium matrix does survive, it seems the DNA can last, entombed in bone, for a very long time. And that has profound implications outside forensic science.
What we have here, if you can get hold of ancient DNA, is a form of biological time machine that can take you into the past to look at genetic material in remote ancestors of modern humans. Of course, it depends how far back in time we can go.
Back in Oxford, Dr. Hagelberg has been looking at that possibility. The first bones she worked on were from an Oxford Archaeological Unit's dig at Abingdon. For archaeologists studying old cemeteries, the potential of her technique is clear.
We were excavating two large cemeteries, a medieval and a Civil War one, and obviously we were hoping to get the sort of normal population indicators, aging, sexing, height out of the bones, and some of this is still being done by traditional means. What Erica was able to show is that it might be possible to pick up family relationships, for instance, from some of the surviving DNA in the bones. She was able to successfully sex 3/4 of the people she looked at, which is a useful check on traditional methods. And it provides a lot of hope for the future in looking at aspects of bone studies that have never been possible before. For instance, one of the late medieval diseases, relevant perhaps to my cemetery, is ague, which has a sort of general description that may correspond to malaria. Now, I know that the medics are very interested in the spread of malaria in its various forms in the past, and they have suggested that ague may indeed be a form of malaria, so that's one example of the sort of thing.
But for this technique to be really useful to archaeologists, it will have to be both cheap and reliable. Some of the most interesting questions DNA could answer concern more than just one individual's genetic makeup.
We could equally look at the questions of population change. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived, did they displace the indigenous Romano-British population, or did they mix with them? Before, it's not been possible to look at the genetic makeup of the two groups and see if there's a complete break between them or whether there's a great deal of mixing. And this could answer some quite important questions about change, invasion, or cultural integration.
Although it may be an exciting thought to an archaeologist to be able to get DNA from a skeleton a few hundred years old, other scientists study much older bones. Like Tim Allen, anthropologists rely mostly on bones to draw their conclusions. But unlike the archaeologists, they have fewer samples to work with. Any extra information these precious samples could provide would be eagerly received.
We know that fossils have got organic material still in them because, for example, radiocarbon dating depends on the fact that fossils, even 30 or 40,000 years old, have a little bit of organic material left, which can be dated. So I always thought it was possible there could be such material in the bone, but the problem is, of course, actually getting hold of it and making enough of it available to be able to be studied in detail.
So would anthropologists really submit their precious samples to Dr. Hagelberg's destructive test?
If the DNA workers can show that looking at, say, cave bear material, they can relate the DNA in fossil cave bears to the DNA of living bears and give us some new information about the relationship of cave bears to living bears. If they can do that, then I would certainly be prepared to let them start on some of our more recent fossil materials, such as this specimen from Cheddar, which is about 10,000, 12,000 years old. And here you can see a sample inside the skull that was removed for radiocarbon dating. Now, a sample like that could be made available for DNA work once the technique is shown to be producing worthwhile results in other species.
The sort of worthwhile questions it could answer go right to the heart of some of the hottest debates in anthropology. For instance, it could resolve exactly where modern humans came from. For years, the majority of anthropologists believed that the first primitive people, Homo erectus, evolved in Africa and about 1 million years ago spread around the world. These Neanderthal ancestors then slowly developed into Homo sapiens, modern humans. This so-called multi-regional model maintains that different racial features started to appear even before Homo sapiens became fully established. But recently, studies of genetic diversity in modern populations suggest we're all much more closely related. The out of Africa theory suggests there was a second wave of migration, with modern humans developing in Africa only 100,000 years ago, and then migrating out and replacing their primitive Neanderthal-like ancestors, with racial characteristics developing much later. But at the moment, there are simply not enough bones around to provide a clear answer.
The people who work on the fossils obviously fundamentally disagree about the relationships. I will look at a fossil and use it to support my out of Africa ideas, and another worker will look at the same fossil and say that it supports the multi-regional model. So the possibility that we can actually get a direct fix on a Neanderthal fossil and see whether it falls within the total expected range of human variation as a human ancestor or not is a marvellous prospect.
No one has tried to do that yet because the very idea DNA from these ancient people could last that long seems extraordinary. But as a paper in Nature last year showed, the DNA molecule can be a survivor. That paper told the story of a magnolia leaf, which was found in a fossilized lake bed. Apparently, it had fallen from a tree directly into the lake and then sunk to the bottom to become trapped in the airless mud and silt. When the researchers broke open this fossilized mud, the leaf was still green, although it turned black when exposed to the air. Despite this, they managed to recover DNA from it, which was almost 20 million years old. It takes exceptional circumstances to allow any organic molecules, let alone DNA, to survive intact over millions of years. At Glasgow University, researchers have been studying fossil shells and trying to tease out original organic material. Recently, Dr. Gordon Curry found fossil shells hundreds of millions of years old that still had original pigment molecules made of protein trapped between the crystals and their shells. So they can now tell what colour these black stripes used to be. But what about bones that are millions of years old? So far, no one has tried extracting DNA, but there have been attempts to isolate dinosaur protein. Just about all we have left of creatures like these are their bones, but these are almost completely fossilized, more stone than bone, and extracting delicate organic molecules from this kind of stuff is not easy.
Here's a vertebrate bone in which the entire central portion has basically been replaced by crystals of calcite. And under those circumstances, the prospects of getting any organic molecules from the original bone still surviving in there are virtually non-existent. But by comparison, if you have this large as a piece of a large vertebrae of a big dinosaur, so the vertebrae extends all the way around here, you can see that very little alteration has happened in here by comparison. The structure of the bone, this porous sponge-like structure, survives here with very little alteration, and you can see a little bit of sediment has got into the rock, but very little indeed. This is a much better prospect for our type of work where we're looking to extract amino acids or whatever from the bones.
By extracting these amino acids, the building blocks of protein, Dr. Curry believes he can tell much about the original animal. For instance, what it ate, whether it was a carnivore or a herbivore. But the Glasgow researchers face the constant problem of ensuring that the amino acids they isolate did belong to the original creature. Even with the latest technology, it's easy to pick up contamination. The same problem applies to DNA. How do you know it comes from the original dinosaur? It could be part of a 60 million year old fossil bacteria. And there are always going to be problems interpreting what's found.
So the idea that you can go along out of the fossil record and pick up a tiny little piece of DNA and get something significant in terms of working out its evolutionary relationships is very much a red herring, I think, for paleontologists. The fact is that if you can't even tell between plants and bacteria that far back, what are the real hopes, what are the real prospects? And I don't think there are any real hopes. It's rather like suggesting that you're going to solve a jigsaw puzzle by throwing away most of the pieces.
Despite the gigantic bones they left behind, it seems unlikely that dinosaurs left any DNA fingerprints. However, there's still one thing DNA can tell us about extinct creatures.
The DNA that we have in our bodies, we could actually consider as being a fossil itself, because DNA evolved many, many million years ago, and it has been copied more or less accurately all the way down through the ages. So the molecules that arrive in our body are more or less similar to the DNA that was present in creatures which are long extinct.
At the moment, the bulk of genetic information about our past still comes from modern DNA. But increasingly, samples of ancient DNA seem likely to provide a new window on the past. Only a couple of years ago, Dr. Hagelberg was working in relative obscurity. Now, scientists from at least 4 different disciplines are knocking at her door.
Altitude 152,000 feet, range 311 miles, speed Mach 8.8.
10 years ago this week, half the population of Britain, 26 million people, watched an event on television wondering if it would end in disaster. On Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock our time, the American Space Shuttle Columbia was returning from its first flight in space. 2 days earlier, when it was launched, Bob Crippen, one of the astronauts, reported that some of the heat-protected tiles had fallen off. Without these, there was a danger of the craft burning up as it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere.
Here, we do have a few tiles missing. I see one full square and looks like a few little triangular shapes that are missing.
For 15 tense minutes of radio blackout, nobody knew what would happen, and then they made contact and heard Bob Crippen.
Columbia's here. What a way to come to California. You're coming.
This, the first flight, had been delayed again and again, but now it looked as though NASA had confounded its critics and once again proved that it had the right stuff.
Down. Welcome home, Columbia. Beautiful, beautiful. And we have a message from President Carter. President Carter would like to pass their congratulations to you for a job well done.
I was one of many millions watching that night. As a journalist specializing in spaceflight, I made a point of keeping well informed about the development and progress of the space shuttle from the very beginning. And 10 years after the first flight, it's perhaps interesting to see to what extent the shuttle has delivered what was promised. And a lot was promised. NASA sold the idea to America as a reusable space truck. The expendable and expensive rockets like this Titan III here for launching satellites just wouldn't be needed anymore. This was all that would be necessary. And NASA maintained at the time that it had the added advantage of carrying people as well as the load, and that it gave a comfortable ride. Well, it certainly does give a less grueling ride for its astronauts than the Apollo moonshot rockets, but all the same, it's a memorable experience.
When we go out to it, it's already very unlike any simulation because the ship itself creaks and groans and steam is coming out. Not steam really, but the mist from the cryogenic fuels loaded aboard. And it seems to have a personality and life of its own that we've never seen before. We ignite the 3 main engines underneath the space shuttle simultaneously, let them burn for about 2 seconds while we check using computers that they've come right up to their proper thrust. And if that is the case, the computers automatically send the signals to light the very large white rockets on the side, 2 of those rockets, and release the hold down arms. All of that happens at once, and you really can feel the whole vehicle shake, shudder, and then continue to vibrate in a rather dramatic and, in a way, a violent but controlled surge forward. We accelerate to 3 G's of force, so we weigh 3 times our normal weight for exactly 2 minutes. Whereupon the white rockets are exhausted. They burn out. There's an enormous flash of light outside and quite a loud explosive sound. Then you realize that the main engines continue to burn and you continue accelerating out more smoothly now with not so much fire and brimstone for a total of 8.5 minutes. Then, when those main engines cut off at the end of the 8.5 minutes, it is a very sharp cutoff. So you go from weighing 3 times your normal weight, and within 1 second's time, you weigh absolutely nothing at all.
America's Space Shuttle Challenger has now put 2 communication satellites in orbit, one for Canada, the other for Indonesia. America's first woman astronaut, Sally Ride, was in charge of the first launching. It went perfectly.
Which is behind the open annex and shield start to open. And there it goes now, you can see it.
The primary job of the shuttle was to launch satellites, commercial, scientific or military. But not every launch works so perfectly, and this is where the shuttle comes into its own, for the simple reason that there are people on board. Again and again it is demonstrated that it is particularly effective at one type of task, the repair or recovery of ailing satellites.
Looking good, Dale. Going for toggle. Hey, toggle, I got it.
In 1984, Joe Allen and Dale Gardner successfully retrieved 2 satellites that had failed to reach their proper orbits, even throwing in a free ad from space. Glorious stuff, but the problem is the shuttle doesn't do this often enough. Fly, that is. It was originally intended to fly 400 missions during the 1980s, and in fact it was only launched just over 30 times. And this year, 1991, the original plan was that it would go up once a week, and so far it's been launched just the once. So in other words, the shuttle is not delivering the goods. In the past 10 years, the program has been plagued by mishap, disaster and constant delays. So what's gone wrong? Before the first launch, it was the protective tiles that caused delays. As the orbiter re-enters the atmosphere, it would burn up were it not for the ceramic tiles that cover it. These are particularly fragile, and 10 years ago it was thought they might not survive the stress of the launch.
But I would say from a technical viewpoint that there's a reasonable and perhaps a substantial probability that there could be catastrophic failure of the tile system, which would mean failure of the flight and possibly the deaths of the astronauts.
Although the tiles are a bit of a nuisance in that they frequently have to be replaced, they have in fact not caused any major difficulties at all. In the construction of the shuttle, in this case the Challenger, NASA tried hard to make it safe. The real problem with the shuttle is that so much compromising had to be done in its design. This is because back in the 1970s, NASA couldn't get a large enough budget to develop it properly. The 2 white rocket boosters on the side, for example, contain solid rather than liquid fuel. This is cheaper technology, but not so controllable, and once they're lit, there is no way of stopping them. Their design helped to bring about the destruction of the Challenger in January 1986. In this shot, it's possible to see flames bursting through the wall of the solid rocket booster. To find out what had gone wrong with the booster rocket, they set up an inquiry. It was established that the rubber seals in the wall of the booster had failed, allowing hot gases to burn through the wall. The rubber seals failed because of freezing temperatures on the launch pad during the previous night. The problem was spotted by Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman.
Oh, I took the stuff that I got out of your seal and I put it in ice water. And I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it maintains, it doesn't stretch back, it stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees.
Well, sorting that problem out caused a delay of 2 years. But some people suggest there's a more fundamental problem. One engineer suggests that the system is put under too much stress at launch. And this is because every time they light the main engines for several seconds before the solid rocket boosters ignite. And when the main engines fire, the whole assembly tilts forward and then moves back as the boosters kick in. And on film, it's just possible to see that move at the top of the shuttle. Now, some engineers argue that this violent movement places too much strain on the components. Well, NASA refutes this. But whatever is happening, it's obvious that something's going wrong. Fuel lines crack, hydrogen leaks, and many components have to be replaced too early and too often, and this causes further delays. Last month, plans for the American space station Freedom were radically simplified. In 1995, astronauts will start building it bit by bit using parts taken up on numerous shuttle flights. The simplification was partly because of a slashed budget, but also because it was realized that on present performance, the shuttle just wouldn't get up there often enough to ever get it finished. The shuttle is effectively out of the commercial launch market. It is now limited to those few military and scientific missions, like last week's, where having people around is a distinct advantage. And as the backlog of unlaunched satellites mounted, the expendable launch rockets have had a rebirth. Titans and other launchers, once assigned to the scrap heap, are now regularly being used to launch satellites that had been intended to go by shuttle. They're not the only things going up on a Titan. It's been proposed that a small space taxi be developed. Called a personnel launch system, it would be a quarter the size of a shuttle orbiter and would carry only people. A model has been built, and what's more, the whole idea has actually been proposed by NASA itself. It would glide back to Earth in the same way as the early test vehicles for the shuttle. Another plan is to revamp an even earlier technology, and that is to drop astronauts to Earth in a capsule on the end of a parachute, just like John Glenn almost 30 years ago. So American plans seem to be reverting back and following a line similar to those adopted by the Soviet Union for the last 20 years. Many people feel that the shuttle is just too complicated ever to be a space truck. NASA plans to use the shuttle well into the next century, but it also agrees that it's possible that it may lose another orbiter within the next 12 missions. And if the loss is as bad as Challenger, then it could mean that the space shuttle is grounded for good, and maybe NASA, who promised so much, could be grounded with it.